Welcome back, Head Detectives. We are going to continue doing our reading for Missing Manatee with Chapter 7 today, so please enjoy. Just a reminder before we get started, please have your detective notebook or a piece of paper out. That way you can jot down some ideas, maybe some questions that you might have, okay, some things that need to be solved. We're going to be doing this for the rest of the year. It's nice and handy to maybe even mark it off as your Missing Manatee section. Okay, so grab that notebook so you're ready to write down some clues. Remember, here are the elements of mystery: detective, victim, suspects, witnesses, alibi, red herring, evidence, crime, and clues. These elements of mystery might not always be a part of each and every chapter, but we will talk about the different chapters that reveal the detective or a victim or witnesses or even our suspect. Okay, so before we jump into reading chapter number 7, I just want to briefly go over chapter 6 with a recap. Chapter 6 was really short. So basically some of the things that happened was Skeet went to the marina and he played the quarter flip game with Blink. Then he checked to see if Deputy Earl had found anything, and Deputy Earl wasn't in. Okay, so then he decided to go to the marina to, Larry, and see if he could catch some of those pinfish so he could earn some extra money for his antenna for his boat. When he went out there and he was fishing, he happened upon a bunch of trash. Okay, and he collected the trash because he thought he could use it for his homework. His artwork, he has to, I guess, paint or draw a picture of a bunch of stuff. And he has happened upon a clue. Now, we don't know what the clue is. I'm not going to tell you yet because we're not there yet. But just so you know, he has collected a clue from his last scavenge, okay? So now we're going to go into chapter 7, and chapter 7 is when they're getting ready to go tarpon fishing. So we're going to learn a little bit more about Dirty Dan. And I'm going to say this several times, take notes on Dirty Dan today, because we're talking about his character, we're talking about how the author makes him out to look, okay? So today you're really focusing on the character of Dirty Dan. So let's go over our learning target. Our learning target today is I can describe characters in the story, including their traits, motivations, or feelings, and explain how the author used words to influence the reader's point of view towards them. Okay, and we've already had this as far as one particular character that we're going to focus on today, which is Dirty Dan. Okay, so we have a couple things that we know about him. In the first few chapters, we learned that he didn't really have a good opinion about manatees. He considered them as speed bumps, okay? So not really a care for other things besides fishing, kind of selfish point of view. We also learned from Skeet's mom that she considered him shiftless, okay, which means that he had no ambition, he was kind of lazy, all he cares about is fishing, so it really puts a negative view on him. Today we're going to hear some more point of views, almost like background, about Dirty Dan to kind of give you more of a description on him. So we are going to be focusing on Dirty Dan today and how the author describes him. So at the end of our reading, I'll go over some of our clues or some of the things that the author has written, and then we'll get into answering some questions about Dirty Dan. All right, so let's go over a few of our vocabulary words. The first vocabulary word is flush, okay? And Miss Garvin is not going to teach you guys about poker. I just briefly wanted to mention to you that if you have a flush, you probably are winning. A flush is when you have 5 cards of the same suit. The next vocabulary word we're going to go over is butterfly milk, okay? And Dirty Dan refers to his alcoholic beverage as butterfly milk. So that's all you need to know about that. The next one is a hatchet. Okay, and when Dirty Dan is telling Skeet the story of how he got his scar on his face, he mentions that he got it from a hatchet fight over a blonde. Okay, so he got it in a fight over a woman, of course. The next vocabulary word I want to go over is Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law is a supposed law of nature. It is an old adage or an observation where the idea of anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Okay, so it's the idea that there's certain things that obviously will go wrong. You know, when you're trying to do something perfect, different things may pop up. You know, like let's say you're typing up your homework and all of a sudden your computer freezes. So it's just like it's the law of nature. Things happen. What it does get confused with is somebody being clumsy or somebody making mistakes. What it's basically telling you is about being prepared, okay, for making a plan. So if you fail to make a plan, because usually when you make a plan, you can figure out what's going to go wrong and fix it. You know, usually. Sometimes you just have to do something and stuff happens. But usually if you have a plan or if you go over stuff, you tend to fix what could go wrong, okay? And when we talk about Murphy's Law here, they're going to be going over the fishing rod and seeing what's wrong with the reel, if there's anything that could go wrong during their fishing trip, okay, with the laws of nature. The next one is casting. And this one, we should probably already know what this is, but just to make sure we understand when they talk about casting, it's the act of throwing bait or lure using a fishing line out, out over the water using a flexible fishing rod. Okay, so just casting it out to try to go get your fish. All right, there is more vocabulary on the next slide, but so far this is what we need to know. All right, so let's continue with vocabulary time. Our next word is going to be hitch. Okay, and a hitch is a knot or obstruction in the drag. Okay, and in the book, I'll read you the line really quick. Basically, Dirty Dan is talking to Ski, and he says, "There's a little hitch in your drag." Okay, and what he means by that is there's some kind of knot or obstruction in his drag. And the drag is the friction plates, okay, in the fishing reel. And what it is, it tightens and it loosens, okay? So there's some kind of knot that's going to mess up his fishing reel. So they're going over Skeet's fishing reel. The next vocabulary word is cockroach. Okay, and we're not referring to this cockroach. We're referring to the type of tarpon fly. Okay, so this is a tarpon fly called cockroach. I don't know if it's because the way they look or maybe the way it moves on the water with the feathers, but regardless, this is what they're referring to. Next vocabulary word is dubiously. So referring back to the book, let me go over here. They're talking about the color of the tarpon fly being orange, and our character Skeet, he's talking to Dirty Dan, and he can't believe that the colors are, the color's orange. So he goes, "They like orange?" I asked dubiously. So he's asking him with doubt. He's just like, "They like orange? Why would a fish like orange?" Okay, so just a vocabulary word that you need to know, dubiously. Next two vocabulary words or phrases is 20-pound test and monofilament line, okay? And what that is basically the line they're using. They are going to talk about 20-pound test a lot. What that basically means is the most weight that a particular line can hold before it breaks. So if they have 20-pound test and the fish is 30 pounds, obviously that line may break, okay? And when you're looking for fishing line, it tells you right there, 25, that one's 25. We dealt with 20 in the book. They also mention the type of fishing line that they have, which is monofilament, right there. And that's just basically a type of fishing line made out of plastic. Okay. And the next thing I kind of want to go over is your knots. We're not going to go really jumping deep into it, but they do mention 3 different knots, so I want you to have an understanding. There are a lot of fishing knots, okay? And the ones that they mention are the bimini twist, okay? And excuse me if I pronounce things wrong. The Hufnagel loop and the surgeon's loop knot, okay? So there's just tons of different ones that they consider what they need to focus on. So you have an idea on what they look like. There you go. Those are the knots for their fishing trip. Okay? I hope you enjoyed our vocabulary time. Keep those ideas in your mind so you have those visuals, and enjoy today, guys.
Chapter 7. I didn't want to wish my vacation away, but I could hardly wait to go fishing with Dan. I hung out with Lenny at his house on Monday. He wanted to know what I'd been doing in the sheriff's boat, and I told him about the Manatee. "Cool," he said. "You're in on an official police investigation?" I explained that I was the only one doing any I was the only one doing any investigation. You want to help me look for the body? I asked. Lenny nodded eagerly, then frowned. I forgot for a second. We're leaving tomorrow for Tampa to visit my grandparents. I'll be gone for the rest of the vacation. Oh, I said, disappointed. Mom made me do my English assignment. What did you write about? I asked. Lenny grinned. How my pet peeve is writing papers over vacation. You did it? I said. Let me see. When I'd finished reading, I told him, it's good, funny. I made a face and added, and very passionate. Well, I sure hope Mr. G agrees with you, he said. With Lenny gone, I spent most of the next day practicing my fly casting in the side yard and waiting to go to Mac's house that night. The time went by really slowly. Mom didn't get home from work until 6:30, so dinner was late. I gulped mine down in a few minutes, but it took Mom and Meemaw forever to eat. I felt like saying, stop talking and chew faster. I knew better than to ask to be excused early, though. It was my night to do dishes. Finally, I put my rod in the holder Mac had rigged up on the back of my bike and fastened my tackle box onto the rack with a bungee cord. When I pulled into Mac's driveway, Dan's and Earl's trucks were both already there. I went inside, and they all greeted me from the card table where they were in the middle of a hand. Grab yourself a drink from the fridge, Mac offered. Give me a minute to take some more money from these fellows, Skeet, said Dan. Then you and I'll get down to business. I pulled a chair over to the table to watch. Eager as I was to talk tarpon with Dirty Dan, I always enjoyed sitting in on Mac's poker games. I liked to look at everybody's hands and listen to them bluff and bet. As usual, Mac and Earl were drinking beer and munching on chips and peanuts. Dan never ate anything. As far as I could tell, he never drank anything but Jack Daniel's whiskey. He called it his butterfly milk. Look at this, Skeet, said Mac, holding his cards so I could see them. He had 5 hearts, a jack high flush. It was a pretty good hand, but I knew better than to say so. I said. Mac laughed and said proudly, that's the way, Skeet. To the other guys he said, did you ever see such a poker face? I tell you, when this kid takes up the game, he's going to beat the pants off all of us. I tried to keep my poker face, but I couldn't help grinning. Mac's was a good hand, but as it turned out, not good enough to beat Dirty Dan's full house. Time for me to quit and give you boys a fighting chance, said Dan, raking in the pot and pocketing the money. Skeet and I have work to do. We sat on the couch on the other side of the room. Dan set his glass and the bottle of Jack Daniels on the table. Then he put on some powerful-looking reading glasses and said, let me see that rod. I handed him my fly rod, and he looked it over intently. While he was examining the reel, I watched him. Dirty Dan was a pretty interesting guy to look at. He wasn't big, but he was strong. Somehow you knew you didn't want to mess with him. His nose had been broken a bunch of times, so it was squashed flat on the top and bent crooked near the end. The main thing you couldn't help noticing was a ragged 6-inch long, 1-inch wide scar down the whole left side of his face. The rest of the skin on his face was a deep leathery brown from all the days he spent out in the sun chasing tarpon, but the scarred skin was kind of pinkish brown, tight and raw looking. When I was a little kid, that scar had half fascinated me and half scared me to death. It still fascinated me. Whenever I looked at it now, I thought about the time I'd asked Dan how he got it. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and Dan had come over to our house to show Mac how to tie a new kind of tarpon fly. I was hanging around, watching and listening, but mostly keeping an eye on that scar. I liked to watch it jump and wiggle around when Dan talked. When there was quiet for a minute, I pointed to his face and said, "What happened?" "Got my nose broke," said Dan, "back in my misspent youth." I didn't know what that meant, but anyway, it wasn't what I wanted to know. "I mean here," I said, reaching out to point at, but not quite touch the scar. Dan took a long sip of butterfly milk, looked at me with his bloodshot eyes, lifted one eyebrow, and said in a low, low voice, "Hatchet fight over a blonde?" Then he went back to tying his fly. I remember sitting there, my mind filled with pictures of Dirty Dan fighting with a piratey-looking guy wearing an eye patch. The guy had a hatchet, but that didn't stop Dan. He went after the guy with nothing but his bare hands. While Dan bravely fought, the blonde-haired lady cried and begged them to please stop. I sure wish I'd asked Dan more questions then. You can blurt out dumb, rude questions when you're a little kid and people think it's funny, or at least they don't hold it against you. I was determined to ask for the whole story someday, but the right moment never seemed to come along. It wasn't the kind of thing that came up in normal, everyday conversation, in which I might say casually, "Speaking of a hatchet fights, Dan, tell me about the one you had over that blonde." Maybe tomorrow, when Dan and I were out in the boat, fishing and talking man to man, I'd have my chance. Dirty Dan interrupted my thoughts by saying, "We're going to have to take this thing apart." He was talking about my reel. "How come?" I asked. He handed me the end of the line and said, "Pull." I pulled. "Feel that?" he asked. "What?" "There's a little hitch in your drag. Could be some rust in there or a grain of sand. Anyway, it's no good." He took a drink of butterfly milk. "Come on, let's get this line off here first. You'll want to put on a new one." As we unspooled the line, Dan said, "When you go after a tarpon, there's 100 things working against you, Skeet. Most of them you got no control over. You got to pay attention to things you can control, and your equipment's one of them." I watched Dan take the reel apart, clean it, oil it, and reassemble it. Then we put on a new fly line. He began tying a nail knot to fasten a length of monofilament line called a leader to the end of my fly line. As I watched Dan's thick, rough fingers at work, he asked, "You know this knot, Skeet?" "I've tried it," I said, "but I can never get it right." "It's a tricky devil," Dan agreed, "but you need to know it. And the Bimini twist, the surgeon's loop, and the Huffenagel too, if you're serious about fishing for tarpon." I nodded. I was serious, all right. To me, everything about tarpon fishing was incredibly cool. I made a silent vow to get my knot book out and do some practicing at home. "Now," Dan said as he worked, "if we tied a regular square knot here, what would happen if you put force on it?" I thought for a minute. "Well, it wouldn't be smooth like a nail knot, so it would get caught in the eyes on the rod." "Exactly," said Dan. And he tied on a series of different strength lines, using the other knots he'd mentioned. "Why am I bothering to do all this?" he asked. "That first section of line is pretty strong," I said. "What is it, 80-pound test?" Dan nodded. "Well, the next section is only 20-pound test. If you used a square knot to tie 80-pound test to 20-pound test, the stronger line would wear on the weaker one, and the weak line would eventually break. Probably when you had a fish on." "You got it," Dan said. "When you're after tarpon, you got to count on Murphy's Law being in effect. You know Murphy's Law?" "If anything can go wrong, it will," I said uncertainly. "Bingo, don't forget it." Dan held up the finished leader and examined it critically. It looked perfect. Each knot was neat, smooth, and strong looking. I whistled in admiration. "You think I tie a good knot, you should have seen my second wife," said Dan. "Her nail knots were beauteous to behold, Skeet. I do miss that woman's knots." He sighed, then muttered, "Too bad she was such a pain in the shorts every otherwise." That's another thing I liked about Dirty Dan. How many grown-ups say what they really mean when they're talking to kids? Suddenly I felt anxious. "Are you sure that 20-pound section is strong enough? If it's any thicker, he'll see it, and he ain't going to eat the fly. First order of business to get him to eat. Then we'll worry about how you fight him." "How do I get him to eat?" I said. "A perfectly placed cast," he answered. Uh-oh, I thought. I began wishing I'd spent more time practicing my casting. "And this," he grinned, making the scar wiggle like a snake, and held up a fly, "my secret weapon." It was a cockroach, which was a fairly common tarpon fly, but I'd never seen one that color. "They like orange?" I asked dubiously. He lifted an eyebrow and whispered, "They're crazy for it. Like alligators after a poodle. You'll see." I nodded eagerly. If you're lucky, he added, and if you don't make mistakes. He tested each of the knots with a final sharp tug and nodded with satisfaction. Looks like you're ready, Skeet, he said. What time should I be at the dock, I asked. 6. What should I bring? I'll keep your stuff, so just bring yourself. I got everything else we'll need. Okay, thanks, Dan. No problemo, Skeet. He poured himself a fresh glass of butterfly milk. Here's to luck, he said, and took a long slug. Sounds like I'm gonna need it. You're gonna need some sleep, too, said Dan. That got Mac's attention, and he looked at his watch. Oops, how'd it get so late? Skeet, you'd better get on home now, or your mama'll skin me alive and feed me to the sharks. I went over to give Mac a hug and say goodnight to the other guys. Sleep tight, Skeeter, said Earl. Okay, I said, but I didn't think there was much chance of that.
I hope you enjoyed Chapter 7. We're going to go over a couple of questions I want you to answer. So the first question is, what is Skeet's point of view of Dirty Dan? Okay, so hopefully you have been jotting down some thoughts and ideas of Dirty Dan as we've been reading, because, that would help you out with these questions right now. I'm going to give you some hints. Some things that we talked about is he talked about how his nose has been broken. Okay, so Dirty Dan's nose has been broken several times in fights. He also has this bad scar on the left-hand side of his face, and it was from a hatchet fight. Okay, or at least that's what Dirty Dan said. So this gives us an interesting point of view that Skeet has on Dirty Dan. That's what you're going to answer about. So what does that make Skeet feel about Dirty Dan? The next question is, what type of person is Dirty Dan based on Skeet's description? Okay, and the difference in this, the first one is, how does Skeet feel? Okay, or how is his point of view? The next one is, what type of person's Dirty Dan? So a sentence that tells me what type of person Dirty Dan is. And the last one is, Dirty Dan is known as the Tarpon Man. Is this a good nickname for him? Now, getting aside from the ruffian or the the roughhousing and the really rough fights that he gets in, he's known as the Tarpon Man. Think about how he was helping Skeet the whole time with this fishing reel and telling him all this knowledge. Do you think that the Tarpon Man is a good nickname for him? And if it is, why? All right, so after you jot down some notes to help you out, go ahead and click on Teams and click on our quiz and answer these 3 questions. Talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.